the show notes really help guide me sometimes. Otherwise, I'll get way off and forget what I was talking about. And
Oh man, well, welcome to our world.
Yeah, that's constant.
Yeah. All right. Well, hey, welcome to the show. For those of you who are new here, my name is Chris, and I'm the host of the Whiskey Noobs podcast. And today we have some very special guests, the Armchair Whisky podcast. So if you guys just want to run through, one thing I've learned from doing interviews is please say your name first. So if I address you, the audience knows who I'm talking to. And then if you just want to talk about your podcast and maybe a quick plug with your social media and things, and then we'll get started.
Yeah. Well, I am Josiah.
And I'm Tyler.
Yeah.
And people will definitely forget that by the time we're done.
But it's okay. So our podcast started this January, and it just started off of a whim. We just drank a lot of whiskey. I have recording stuff as a musician and kind of producer. And so it was just like, hey, we could easily do a podcast, and that would be really fun because we're pretty much just trying whiskey and talking about it once a week anyway, at least once a week. And we were just at a phase where we were experimenting and trying a bunch of different things, and we just thought it'd be a great way to document our own journey through trying whiskey and what that was like. And while we're doing that, also provide a service to others like us who are maybe about as far along in their whiskey journey as us, or not as far, so that we could kind of just help be a source of information for people who are coming up behind us. And so yeah, that's how it started. We do an episode a week, and sometimes two, and that's pretty much the genesis of the whole thing. Was just why don't we do this? It's just as easy as what we're already doing, except we take a little bit of time to throw some mics into the equation, and we put some extra intentionality behind it. That's it.
Yeah. We and we've kind of morphed along the way. We've started to do do a little bit more with interviews, whereas when we started, our first 10 episodes were all just like ourselves.
Yeah.
Which were fun, but then we were like, hey, we need to maybe bring some experts into the equation, and then that became a lot of fun. And now that's the issue that we're running into, is it's almost like we've got too much content, so every once in a while we throw it at like a Wednesday episode or something like that. But it's been a lot of fun. We're on social medias. We've got all kinds of different ones, all the usual Twitter,
the Instagrams, the
tweeters, but mainly we're on Instagram at Armchair Whisky. Yeah, and
that is whiskey, not the way I spell it, right?
That's right. Whiskey
the right way.
Oh,
just kidding.
Okay.
We won't start this battle.
Low hanging fruit. Easy show.
Yeah, we do it without the E. And yeah, I don't know if there was really that much of a reason for that, other than the fact that we're
Canadian.
We're Canadian. And then also we preferred Scotch, so probably those two things factored into it.
Yeah,
starting out.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Yeah, going into it for me, people always just assumed I preferred bourbon, which I kind of ended up. I drink a lot of bourbon now, but because I used the E, and everybody just assumed that was because I preferred bourbon. It was just because I was from the U.S. and we use the E, so yeah,
totally. Yeah, well, you could prefer Irish because they use the E there.
Yeah,
that's true.
Exactly.
No, I'm gonna throw a wrench into it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're super excited to be on the show, on your show, and it should be a lot of fun. We're kind of bringing you a whiskey, which is fun.
Yes. Yeah. So to put a little twist on it, as we mentioned, I drink a lot of bourbon. We're going to be reviewing very much not a bourbon today. And I have a very important question for you guys. Before I get any farther, their socials will be down below, by the way. But I have a very important question about this scotch that we're drinking today. I'm not sure how familiar you are with my show. I'm horrendous at pronouncing Scotch names, and this is no small challenge, the name of this Scotch.
That's very true, yeah.
So how do I pronounce it?
Yeah, this one's a Bunnahabhain. Kind of that B is like a bit of a V sound if you want to get super technical, depending on your dialect if you're speaking Gaelic. But Bunnahabhain,
which you're fluent in,
which Gaelic, I'm fluent in. But yeah, Bunnahabhain is the proper. It's a very acceptable American rendering of how to pronounce that.
Bunnahabhain. Are you actually fluent in Gaelic?
No.
Okay.
I once did I did a great deal actually, like considerably. Considering that, it's such an obscure language, I did a pretty good amount of learning on Duolingo with the app once. If you've ever used that.
Oh yeah.
Just because I was watching Outlander.
Just because
and
you were pretentious enough to try
I was watching
it, right?
Outlander, and I'm pretentious enough to want to have a little bit of an understanding of why in the world consonants make the most crazy sounds in Scottish or Gaelic, because Bunnahabhain nothing makes sense. Like Glenfiddich is Glenfiddich, Brooklady is ICH, but it's pronounced E.
Yeah.
Brooklady, but Glenfiddich is ICH and is pronounced ick. And so there's just no consistency. And I think a lot of that's down to dialect. But I've dabbled a lot in trying to understand how to pronounce things.
Oh, okay.
But there's no rhyme. From what I can tell, the Scottish are just real bastards. There's no rhyme or reason to it. They're just trying to screw with you.
Yep. And then to throw another wrench in the plan, Chivas or Chivas Regal. The first time I had on the show, the whole time I said Chivas. Because I thought, oh, CH, it's Ch. No, it's not.
Yeah.
You just got to say it how you say it and with conviction. That's the rule. Like, however you say it, just stick to your guns on it.
And then people will harass you until you correct yourself.
Yeah, I did actually have somebody message me like, yeah, it's Chivas, it's not Chivas. So I was like, but I own up to it. I come by it honestly. I cannot pronounce most Scotches. So we got Bunnahabhain, right?
Yeah.
Which I previously, reading the label, thought was Bunnahabhain because it's AIN.
Yeah.
Good enough.
Close. All right.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to give this a try here. For those of you listening, if you haven't heard of Bunnahabhain before, this is just their 12-year Scotch. Now, this is an Islay Scotch, also a single malt, and if I'm not mistaken, well, I guess I shouldn't make any assumptions here. It's Islay. Is it peated? I haven't smelled or tasted yet.
No.
It is an unpeated, and that's kind of the claim to fame.
Okay.
So this is an unpeated Islay. Not the only unpeated Islay, but if you paid attention to the branding closely, you would feel like it's the only unpeated Islay, because that's kind of how they've chiseled out a niche.
Seem that way.
And it is an exceptional whiskey for anyone, whether you like Islays or you don't like Islays. I think it rides this line of being unsmoky. So if you're not into the smoky thing, it's still really good. But if you love Islays, you still get some of the Islay maritime characteristics in there that are really, really, I guess they're a defining part of Islay whiskeys, and that's still here. You just don't have the smoke. And so it's in a lot of ways, that's what's so exciting about it is you get to kind of taste what makes an Islay other than just smoke, because I think a lot of times Islay is just the smoky whiskey, and that's not true at all. We would know if you dive into Scotch enough, you know that there's a lot of smoky whiskeys. It's not all Islay. And so, but there is something that makes Islay unique. I think in Bunnahabhain 12, you can discover a greater depth to what makes that kind of, to that maritime influence beyond the smoky peaty side of things. So it's fun.
All right. Well, I'm sold. That sounds fantastic. I'm excited to try it. I was wondering, because I noticed when I was looking through the flavor notes and things on their website, they mentioned a little bit, I think they mentioned smoky on the nose. We'll see here when we get into it. But they didn't on the palate. And I was like, maybe this is not peated. So,
yeah.
All right. I'm excited to give it a try. Let's go ahead and take a taste of it. And I'm going to give what I think I'm smelling. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
So I'm obviously not the Scotch experts in the room here, but it almost is reminding me of like a normal, to me, not being super big into Scotch, Highland and Speyside are pretty similar to me. Almost like that, but with like a tanginess that I don't know how to describe yet. That's not as soft as your Speyside or your Highland is. Yeah. Almost like salty.
Yeah, briny. If you've dove into the Lafroig or Ardbeg, I think this has a little more of the Lafroig brininess, But when you remove that really smoky character, that billowing smoke, and that iodininess kind of out of there, this has a little bit of that medicinal for sure. I think that some of that tanginess is kind of on that medicinal side as well. But if you were to take a Lafroig, and briny is a term that's often used with Lafroig, like Lafroig 10, this is like a good kind of reference point for where that brininess is if you were to not experience the smoke with it, and the heavy iodine.
Yeah.
Heavy Band-Aid note.
Yeah, Frog is like eating a medicine cabinet.
Yeah. And so you kind of, I do find it's a really good reference point for what's underneath the smoke of Islay whiskeys, even though it's its own thing and it stands kind of on its own two legs. But
yeah, that's a great way to put it. I think I might have to do in the future an episode comparing with Lafroig a bit, because I do have Lafroig 10, and I've used it a few times on the show. I actually used it in my last episode that I used it in. It was to basically wreck our palate and test out palate cleansers.
Oh, wow.
So I used Lafroig because I thought that'll do.
Well, it does. Yeah, it does wreck your palate for sure. It's hard to go back to something really sweet when you drink some Lafroig.
Yeah.
I think I actually see what you mean. There's definitely the maltiness in there. I mean, it's a single malt, but yeah, briny is an awesome word for that tangy that I couldn't describe. It is almost just like it like it's salty almost. It gets your jaws like that. Salt. Yeah.
Do you find that where you drink a lot of bourbon, do you find that you get that malty ness like immediately whenever you go to Scotch?
Yes, very much. Scotch, and then also Irish. They have like a distinct, when you come from bourbon, they have a distinct different type of sweetness, because they both are kind of sweet based. That's why most people enjoy, whiskey. But it's almost, I've always described it as like a paler sweetness with a malt based drink. Whereas when it's corn based, it's almost got this darker sweetness, more of like a caramel, less of like a vanilla and honey. Yeah, Irish specifically always gives me like a granola type, whereas this sometimes a single malt will give me like a granola, or like fresh cut straw or fresh cut hay, something like that.
Yeah, I get this one has. I see where you lean with the like Highlander Speyside and that kind of sherried raisiny thing, but there's a sour edge or a sour side to this that kind of tips away from that dark, more like maraschino cherry, which you'd get out of like a typical kind of Speyside, like Aberlour or Glenallachie, or something
like a sherry.
Yeah, that more sherried, rich, sweet cherry. This one has like almost like, I would put it into Glendronach. Actually has a similar thing. This has, I associate it with if you've ever had the cherry sour candies, they're like the round ones, and they like stain your tongue like Sith lightsaber red.
And once you've eaten a few, you're like, you're ruined for the rest of the night.
But it's got this like really nice tangy sour note, and I find Bunnahabhain does that quite well. It delivers that nice distinct pleasant sour without being off-putting, and I think to me I really enjoy that in whiskeys, when they deliver this sour note without being off-putting. The sour can be kind of off-putting, and so Bunnahabhain does that really well, among other things. This is one of my favorite whiskeys.
Yeah, I was just about to say, the reason why Josiah is talking up a storm is because this is definitely his favorite, and we haven't actually done, I don't think we've done an episode on
No, we haven't. Yeah,
on our, so
it's not my favorite, but it's like
it's up there.
It's up there. Yeah. I have a lot of respect for this whiskey.
I can definitely see it. The tanginess that you're talking about, like almost like a sour candy, it really fixes one of my complaints I have sometimes about like Speyside and Highland, and that's that they can be slightly more one-dimensional than some of the bourbons I have. And maybe that's because I drink some pretty strong bourbons and stuff, but this gives it way more dimension. It really does. A lot more complexity to it. And you mentioned the sherry finish. I'm just checking my notes here. I think so. We've got bourbon and sherry casks, and then so they mix the two of those, which I don't have a ton of experience with the bourbon cask finish. Obviously, bourbons you're finishing in white oak, so I don't have quite as much with that. But
Yeah, bourbon, you're gonna deliver in some of that more vanilla creme brulee side of your flavor for
Yeah.
sure. The sherry casks often are gonna lend. They lend to a tan. It depends on how sherry they are, how heavily you use that, but they lend themselves to a fairly tannic thing sometimes too, which is kind of why they deliver such a good flavor. I think is that they give you this balance with this really tannic thing that's coming off of the cask, as well as these fruity notes and sometimes floral notes that come out of it too, and they're really rich and dark. And so, yeah, and I think that it all shows up really well in this, as well as you get like, I think there's like a distinct fishy note in this, which would normally be bad,
Fishy.
but I think it's a good thing. Like, it's really seasidey. Um, and I think that I really enjoy how that shows up, especially on the nose. I think that's more where you notice it. It'd be maybe a little weird if you drank it and you were like, that tastes like
fish.
omega-3.
Omega-3.
Yeah. I think I can see it with the brininess on the nose, which almost on the palate comes through as like the sour candy that you were mentioning.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I definitely would say as well, I would say I think I enjoy the nose more than other scotches, other single malts I've had, just because there's more going on. I think that's my bigger complaint than the palate, because usually with any whiskey, if you sit with the palate long enough, you can pull a whole lot from it. But sometimes with the nose, the alcohol makes that a challenge. And with this, I mean, the flavors jump up to meet you out of the glass for sure. So I will mention briefly their actual tasting notes that they say you should get from this on the Bunnahabhain website. So for the nose, it says fresh and aromatic, fruity floral with hints of dried fruit and subtle prevalence of smoke. I think the fruitiness comes through. I want your guys' opinion as well. My opinion would be that the fruitiness comes through in the sweetness of it. But I don't know if I would say smoke. And maybe that's because bourbons always have a real woody flavor, and an actual Islay has insane smoke.
Yeah, when you're comparing it, and we just came off of just before this, we were drinking a bunch of Lagavulin, so it's not even anywhere compared to that. But they're,
if I say char rather than smoke, do you detect something there? Does that
I was
word...
just about to say, like, it's almost like everything is a little charred. Instead of like smelling the smoke distinctly, it's like you smell some of that stuff with a little bit of a charredness.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked to multiple people, but I think it was our friend Davin, who is the Canadian whiskey like expert, and he said about basically he was just like, and lots of people say this, but he was like, you just can't really trust what brands say their flavors are. He was just like, you just can't. And so that's kind of affirming, because I think as an enthusiast, you're trying whiskey and you're looking for a baseline on a whiskey, especially when you're kind of early days. You're maybe like, let's say like under, you've tried less than 50 different whiskeys. You've got around the regions, like, the Irish, the Canadian, the Scotch, the bourbon, maybe Japanese. You've got kind of those covered. You've tried a little bit of everything or pretty close to it. When you're at that point, you're still using the baseline, and oftentimes you will use like what the bottle says about itself. And our friend Davin was essentially just like, you really can't use that as a baseline. A better baseline is going to be found off of like, honestly, your podcast or our podcast or a YouTuber like Ralphie, or many other YouTubers. Like, you're going to find a better baseline from other enthusiasts. Or there's apps you can use, like with wine, I use an app called Vivino, and it's all user reviews. And so that I find that a lot more accurate than anything.
Whiskey base.
But yeah, our whiskey base, if you're talking whiskey, and which we are talking whiskey, I suppose that makes sense.
If you're talking whiskey. Wait, what is this podcast about?
This isn't about wine.
Wine noobs.
Yeah. Yeah. And so yeah, I think that's comforting in a way, because I think you often will taste a whiskey and then be like, why don't I get nutmeg?
Yes.
Because you see You see it on the box, and it's like you just have to go. You have to decide to have some confidence in what you taste, and not pretending to taste something that you don't.
Absolutely,
taste, even if it's on the label.
Yeah, I could not agree more. And that's actually a really big part of why I do that the way I do it, where I always, unless it's a rushed review, which happens sometimes, I always do it myself first. And then I talk about the notes that they say, because we've had some that are just so far off that it's not even close. And I've also noticed from doing that, from kind of trying to be as honest as I can and then reading their notes, some, at least with bourbon, you'll have them spruce up like a general white sugar sweetness by calling it like syrup or honey or something. And it's like, this just tastes sweet, especially the lower shelf ones. And they'll definitely try to get enough truth in there that people tend to believe it, and then they'll veer away a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they'll try to make it sound really grandiose.
Yes.
Like, this is like frolicking through a field while licking a stick of honey or something. You're like, what the frick?
A stick of honey?
I don't know.
Yeah. It's like those recipes online where instead of just giving you the recipe, they're like, I remember the first time I had this dish. And it's like,
that's exactly. Yeah, you're like scrolling through. You're like, come on, I just want to know like what you put in this. I don't need to know your backstory.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. All right, so to continue with our comparison to their notes here, the palate, they say light with fruit notes, nutty flavors with a sweetness and hints of vanilla and caramel. I always kind of compare and contrast with that, with what I think I get. I think nutty's a good one that I wouldn't have picked out, but I want to try it again and see what I think about that. But what are you guys thinking?
I think that a lot of the time malt can translate. You can either translate it as cereal, like, you know, some sort of grain or wheat, like whether it's bread, whether it's like actual like a bowl of cereal, or whether it's something else. Or I think sometimes you can translate it as nutty, because like it just has that kind of dry, like
dusty.
Yeah. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's not. I think that any single malt you could say is nutty to some degree. Maybe not every, but like I just think that if any of them are malty, you could also say they're nutty, because it's hard. I think some people have a hard time distinguishing like what malty means and what nutty means, because they're pretty similar.
Yeah. Yeah, I get it. To me, nutty is not a defining thing that I come out of this whiskey thinking, but it's something I can see.
Right. Yeah. That's why it wasn't something I would have thought of, and then when I read it, I'm like, oh, that kind of makes sense. For me, I would say the vanilla and the caramel come across the strongest to me. More vanilla than caramel to me, because I get a lot of caramel in bourbon. Obviously, it's a very common note, but definitely like a strong vanilla flavor to me. And then
and I find it sits a little salty on your tongue.
Yeah.
Yep, I was just about to say that. And then strong brininess for sure.
Yeah. I really appreciate that. Like, I think when I started getting into whiskey, I really was dabbling predominantly in Scotch, and I gravitated towards the more challenging or just different side of things. So I was really into Lafroig and Ardbeg. Those two really fascinated me. And when I kind of balanced out from that, Bunnahabhain just was this perfect kind of middle ground where, you know, after Islay, I went to Speyside and the Highlands, and you get these less abrasive flavors out of those regions, or that region. And then I got bored of that, and then I bought a bottle of Bunnahabhain, and I was like, this is exactly kind of what I look for in a whiskey. I look for something that's really interesting, but it's really interesting, but it's got to be balanced, and it's got to have a sense of identity of its own. And I think they did this really well. The downside to Bunnahabhain is just they don't have as strong of a brand recognition as other Islay whiskeys. The big three specifically, maybe you could say four, but the big three being Lagavulin, Lafroig, Ardbeg.
Oh, well, but like Bowmore has to be in that. But like whether or not you respect them,
not so much to enthusiasts. I don't think, unless you're a collector of high end, whiskeys. But yeah,
okay, yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. And you bring up a point that I actually wanted to ask you both about: is what got you guys into whiskey, into where you are now with the podcast? I think you kind of mentioned you were already into it and you had the equipment, so you did the podcast. But what got you into it initially?
You can go first because you started.
For me, it was all like, it was lifestyle, man. I'm just a sucker.
The
I'm
marketing.
yeah. Well, I liked, like, there were different musicians I liked, and they happened to be from like the UK and Ireland, and that just kind of sucked me in. It's a bit of just like yeah, it's a byproduct of this. It's just a, sorry, not a byproduct, but it's part of the scene, was the whiskey, because it was kind of associated with the music scene that I was just keep like in touch with. And so to me, it was like, yeah, I want to understand why whiskey's good. And so I just started doing that. And I started with Irish, actually. In the initial phases, I was starting with Irish, and probably something that I don't usually talk about is I was just as interested in how whiskey was made as I was actually drinking it and tasting it myself. That process to me seemed so enchanting and artistic, and it was just yeah, I don't know, like that really drew me in, the kind of the alchemy to whiskey, and that artistic process to how you craft something like that, in the same way that an artist might, paint a painting or write a song or to do a sculpture or whatever. Whiskey seems to have to depend upon this high level of knowledge, and at the same time, people taking these risks to explore new flavors. And so that really fascinated me too, right at the onset. And those two things were kind of how I started drinking it. And so I went from Irish, and then I went to these big Islay Scotches, and then it just opened up from there.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, for me, I started after you had already kind of started exploring, and I'm mainly like, it was kind of, I was just like, I don't really like any drink very much, so I was like, I should find something that I like, and so I just started like explore, like, I obviously knew, anybody can enjoy a cocktail, it's just full of sugar and coolers and all that stuff, but I was like, I want to find something that I actually enjoy. I couldn't stand beer. The yeastiness of it was just like too much for me, or the hoppiness. And so I just like tried to jump around trying to find something, and for whatever reason I just tried a bunch of stuff, and I was like, yeah, whiskey actually, like, I could see myself enjoying that. And then the more I looked into it, the more that I understood about the history of it, and kind of the stories around it, the richness of it, the community around it, and I think that's what kind of drew me into Scotch mainly, is because obviously there's like that's the main thing that, like, especially like the Scotch industry pushes on people, is like the history and the richness of the history. And even though like bourbon has just as much history, and you know what I mean, and Irish whiskey has just as much history, but for whatever reason it seems like Scotch, their big claim is like, no, we're the oldest and we're the best and we're the most rich in our history. But yeah, anyway, I was just drawn to that, and then just the exploration when you were starting to do that, then I was like, oh, I kind of want to explore a little bit more.
And we were living apart at the time.
Yeah.
Like, you were in Ontario and I was on the East Coast, and we've been friends since we were kids, and we are both terrible at, like, catching up, FaceTiming and whatever. And then when we were both into whiskey, it was like we were FaceTiming like every week. It seemed like we were just doing it all the time, and it really brought us together. It was an excuse to, like, hey, let's FaceTime, because we would FaceTime like once every 6 months at best, and then it was all the time, because we're trying whiskey together. And so it really was, that aspect to it is a massive part, I think, of why we both have become so enthusiastic about it.
Wow. Yeah. I love both of those answers, because you brought up like all of the points that I bring up in my first episode, and then in my 1-year anniversary episode I talked about it again, as to why we drink whiskey. And you brought up all of the parts. I mean, everybody, especially if you get big into TikTok and things, everybody likes to comment that, if you can drink something that's 120 proof, you're an alcoholic, stuff like that. And I've always said, it's about the art form, first of all. I mean, it's like staring at a really, really intricate painting, but with your taste buds instead.
Yeah.
And it's about the community. And you mentioned how it brought you guys back together and how, you know, you like the culture and the community surrounding it and the history that you can learn about. So that's awesome to hear. That's I had a pretty similar journey in terms of why it drew me in. For me, I actually got started because my dad was into whiskey, and then it kind of naturally. But the things that drew me in, very similar. So that's really cool to hear. Yeah, that's awesome. So I'm rounding out this glass of Bunnahabhain, which I can now pronounce, which is awesome.
Yeah.
And I'm going to give, this is a little backwards for me. I almost always have my guests give their final thoughts first because they're usually newer than I am. But since I'm doing a Scotch, I'm going to give my final thoughts first. That way you can tell me what you think about my first experience with Bunnahabhain.
Yeah.
So,
sounds good.
Yeah. So my final thoughts, I would say, I was trying to think on that sour candy metaphor that you gave. And I think if most scotches that I've had, now mind that the only Islay Scotch I've had aside from Bunnahabhain up to this point is Lafroig right here. We're having Ardbeg soon, actually. But I think if most of the scotches that I have had are like a gummy bear or like a fruit snack, Bunnahabhain is like a Sour Patch Kid. And I always really like Sour Patch Kids. And I like that there is that dichotomy of the sour and the sweet. You're getting both. It adds a complexity to it that I think, and this is why I could see myself getting into peated stuff pretty deeply. I think it keeps me more interested. Not that I don't like Highland and Speyside. I drink a lot of Highland and Speyside compared to obviously Islay. But it keeps me interested because the same thing that you do with a high rye bourbon, where you take the sweetness of the corn and you add the rye spice to make it more exciting, is kind of what they're doing here. Where you've got the sweetness, the caramel, the maltiness, the graininess of a single malt. And then you've got this like briny, sour tang that gets your jaws that makes it a little bit more exciting. That is something that I can say I'm very impressed with. I'm actually pretty well impressed with this bottle. So I appreciate you guys for telling me to try this one for the show. But those are my final thoughts on it. But I will give you guys the floor and let you say your thoughts on it, especially since you have so much more experience in Scotch, your thoughts on it in comparison to peated Islay, if there are any other unpeated Islay that you guys have had and can compare to, and then just your other regions in general.
Yeah, I'll let you do it, because if I do it, I'll talk way longer. And if you do it, I'll just add to what you say.
You'll add to what I'm saying. Well, I think it's Bunnahabhain is one of the best scotches that's like fairly affordable, the 12. Like, I don't know what you would have paid for it in Ohio, but it's like under 100 here, which is like quite good.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
I believe it is $62 in Ohio, and we do have state pricing, so the state determines that. But
yeah. So it's quite an affordable.
Like what would be along the lines of that here, just as a reference point? That $100 range,
$100?
like Port Charlotte is
more than that. Yeah,
which is
it's
a
like
Scotch.
110.
What's a bourbon that would fall in that?
That's
category?
100.
Yeah.
Heaven's Door.
Heaven's Door is $70 or $80.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know the bourbons.
Yeah, we just don't get enough bourbon then, I guess.
Though, wow, bourbon's pretty reasonable here.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
So maybe it's hard to compare, but Green Spot would be a whiskey that would be like an Irish whiskey that'd be on par.
Yeah.
Canadian whiskeys, you're getting into crazy, awesome whiskeys that are in the $100 range. But
yeah, for Scotch, like under 100 is pretty good. Like
Lagavulin 16 is like 157 or something.
Almost 160. Yeah.
Right now.
Yeah.
Or Lagavulin.
Yeah. So I think or I guess you have the Lafroig 10. The Lafroig 10 would be about the same price.
It's about 90. So it's similar to Bunnahabhain.
Yeah. So I think we both would agree that this is probably one of the best scotches you can get for a pretty good price. Yeah, it's really good. It's really well balanced. It's got a complexity that brings you back to it over and over and over. I don't find that we've ever felt like we're just kind of over it or bored of it.
No, I
by
always
any
want to
means.
dip into this whiskey.
Yeah. Whereas I find that there are a lot of Speysides and Highlands that like you almost feel like you're just drinking the same thing over and over, even though you're maybe trying different ones. You're kind of like, oh, that's pretty similar, and that's pretty like there are some really good ones, but I do find that with this Bunnahabhain, it just seems like it's got all of these components to it that really make it a unique and really well made whiskey.
Yeah,
well distilled.
I think what really excites me about this is that I think that a lot of enthusiasts in the Scotch world, they at some point, usually fairly early on in their journey, get hooked into Islay, and then usually get kind of over that. But Isla's just so Islay has such a reputation, but you have to take most great Islay whiskeys as an Islay whiskey. But Bunnahabhain is like, I would put that up against anything and just be like, this is Scotch whiskey. Like, if you want a really great glass of Scotch, this is a great glass of Scotch. It represents Islay, but it also represents kind of some of that Highland characteristic. And it overall, I think, is a really good example of Scotch with a lot of character to it. So it's very interesting. I'm not saying that it's a kind of stereotypical Scotch at all. I'm just saying that I think that it doesn't have to be an Islay Scotch, like it tastes like Scotch with a lot of interesting character, but you wouldn't necessarily be like, this is definitely Islay. And because of that, I think you say this is definitely Scotch, and it's definitely its own thing. Mm-hmm. And that uniqueness sets it apart. And it could kind of be from any region, and it would be an outlier, because it's an outlier no matter where you put it, but it is also Scotch. So it rides those two lines of being clearly single malt Scotch, but clearly something that's not like any other thing within Scotch. And I think that that's a masterful execution of
Mm-hmm.
of the brand and of the distillers and of the company. Yeah, I think they've just done something really incredible by it. So
yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I would venture to say that I think if I come back to it, I'm going to see it differently next time, which is always something I like about a whiskey, when you can come back and it's not the exact same whiskey you just drank.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I could definitely see that being the case. And yeah, I think you guys summed it up great, and I appreciate you recommending this one for this episode. Hopefully this is something a little different for my followers as well. We've done Scotch, but this is, as you mentioned, unlike anything we've had on the show so far. So it's definitely got a creative flair to it that I very much enjoyed.
Awesome. Glad you did.
Yeah, it's great. It's always great when you're pleasantly surprised by a whiskey. There's no better feeling than that.
Yeah,
for
totally.
Sure.
Yeah, so I appreciate you guys recommending that, and I appreciate you guys coming on the show, taking the time to be on the show. For those of you guys listening, I mean, you've heard them talking about whiskey. You know what you're getting yourself into. You got to go over there and check out their podcast, and give them some ratings and reviews. Go check out their socials, which will be down below. You guys have anything else you'd like to say to round out your plug for your podcast?
Yeah, well, we're going to do the inverse of this on our episode with you. And so we hope to be pleasantly surprised by a bourbon.
That's right.
And so if you are listening to this and you want to find out if we were pleasantly surprised by Eagle Rare, then come on over and check it out.
All right.
That's right.
Yeah, that sounds great. So go over there and check out that episode for those of you guys listening right now. But that's all that I got for the episode today. Tyler, Josiah, thank you guys. I appreciate it. This has been a blast. That's all I got for this episode today, though, guys. So as always, I'll leave you with learn to drink, drink to learn. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Whiskey Noobs. If you like the show, please make sure that you tell anyone you know who you think would be interested in the hobby or in the podcast. That way we can help to spread the word and continue to grow. Please also make sure to review the show on Apple Podcasts and share our posts on Instagram at whiskey_noobs or on TikTok at Whiskey Noobs Podcast. It only takes a couple of minutes and it really does a lot to help spread the word and grow the podcast. Also, there is an email list for the show. If you'd like to join, you can just send an email to whiskeynoobspodcast@gmail.com and in the subject line put email list. I will add you to the list and then you'll be updated every month with the whiskeys that we will be drinking on the show throughout the month. That way you can drink right along with us and see if you're getting the same notes. Once again, thank you so much for listening to the show. The Whiskey Noobs Podcast does not support underage or otherwise irresponsible consumption of alcohol.